On behalf of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I would like to welcome you all here this morning to hear from United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid al-Hussein, in his address, "Can Atrocities Be Prevented? Living in the Shadow of the Holocaust." My name is Cameron Hudson. I direct the museum's Center for the Prevention of Genocide. And the question, which you can kind of see on the screen, posed by our speaker today is one that is central to the field of atrocity prevention. It is a principal concern of this institution, and it is, I believe, of increasing importance to this and, I hope, future American administrations. Regrettably, this was not a question posed by American policymakers 75 years ago, as war raged across Europe and millions upon millions fell victim to a pernicious ideology. That is now one of the principal missions of this institution, to poke, prod, sometimes pester, and cajole policymakers, scholars, and the millions of people who walk through the doors of this building every year, and to ask that sometimes uncomfortable question, but always necessary: can atrocities be prevented? For those of us who work on these issues every day, there is, I think, at least a shared sense of outrage in the face of what now seems like a daily stream of reporting of atrocities occurring or threatened across the globe against Yazidi populations in Iraq and Syria, the Rohingya in Burma, the Nuba and the Darfuri in Sudan, Dinka and Nuer in South Sudan, Christian and Muslim in the Central African Republic, just to name the ones that were in my Google alert this week. But despite what I believe is an emerging consensus, or at least what I hope is an emerging international consensus on the need to prevent, to respond, and to protect, the world's rhetorical commitment to these issues does not meet with reality, which suggests to me that the question the High Commissioner has put before us today has no greater urgency. So, sir, on behalf of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, on behalf of our nearly 100 survivor volunteers and our many partner organizations who are here with us today, I want to thank you for choosing this venue to speak with. Before I begin, I just want to touch on a couple of housekeeping matters. I want to remind everyone that this is an on-the-record event, and so you're all encouraged to tweet your reactions using the GenPrev hashtag. We're also webcasting this event, so for those of you who were not able to join us here in Washington today, wherever you are in the world, I hope you'll be a part of the conversation that we're about to have. You can use the hashtag or tag us at Holocaust Museum if you have questions for the High Commissioner. We're gonna be taking some questions after his talk. And so with that, I have really the distinct honor of welcoming one of our incredible survivor volunteers, Margaret Meisner, to the stage to introduce our speaker. Margaret, as she's coming up, I want to say a few words about Margaret. You can come up. She is one of many survivor volunteers that we have at the institution, many of whom are here in front, and I hope you'll get a chance to talk to some of them before you leave. But Margaret and her colleagues are the greatest ambassadors that we have for the work of this museum, because their presence here grounds us in the history. It reminds us why this institution was established, not only to commemorate, but also to learn. And so I learned a lot from Margaret on a trip that we took to Rwanda last year to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the genocide there, and it's really my privilege to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Cameron, for this very generous introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I feel honored that I have been asked to speak at this very special and important occasion. As you heard, I am a volunteer at the museum. I guide, I translate from Czech into English, and I speak to many groups, adults and young people. A few words about myself. I was born in Austria in 1922, but I lived in Czechoslovakia. When the Germans invaded Austria in 1938, my mother sent me to Paris, by myself in a world without media, when one had no idea of what was to follow. Mother thought I would be safe in Paris. She joined me in Paris after all of Czechoslovakia was annexed in 1939. In 1940, as Germany was about to occupy all of France, Mother was deported by the French to a French concentration camp. Alone, I left Paris the day before the city fell to the Germans on a bicycle. I found my mother by miraculous coincidences, and together we tried to get out of France, but we were not able to get the needed exit permit. So we ended up by walking across the Pyrenees, up on the French side and down on the Spanish side. We got caught by the Spanish police and went to a Spanish jail where we were told we would be handed over to the German authorities in Spain. So all this effort only to be told to be handed over to the Germans in Spain, of all places. Again, most fortunately, we were able to get to Portugal, from where we were able to immigrate to the United States exactly 3 years after I left my home in Prague. As a Holocaust survivor, it is important to me that the world remember the lessons of the Holocaust. Unfortunately, the lessons have not been well learned. Our exhibit, From Memory to Action, illustrates the genocides that happened while we were watching them on our television screens. Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur in the Sudan. The exhibit shows that genocides have antecedents and that they could have been prevented if the world had paid attention. The museum is now addressing this issue by researching how to predict atrocities and how to prevent them. The museum is one of the few institutions that is trying to link what we learned from the research of the World War II Holocaust to actions that would prevent the murder and dislocations of the millions who are suffering today in various parts of the world. The recent 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz provides an opportunity for us to reflect on the failure of the international community to prevent the Holocaust and to recommit ourselves to preventing future atrocities. So we are honored today to host the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, who will address atrocity prevention today and the lessons we must remember from the Holocaust. Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein assumed his post as High Commissioner in September 2014. Previously, he served as Jordan's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. He was also the first president of the Assembly of States Parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and served as political affairs officer in the former Yugoslavia. Throughout his career, the High Commissioner has dedicated his career to building peace and promoting human rights. We at the Holocaust Memorial Museum are dedicated to making sure that genocide and other atrocities never happen again. We are honored that the High Commissioner is with us today to deliver remarks about the importance of atrocity prevention in modern times. Please join me in welcoming High Commissioner Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein.
Thank you, Margit, for your warm introduction. I'm honored to be addressing you this morning here at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., only days, as Margit just said, after we together commemorated the liberation of Auschwitz 70 years ago. I start by paying homage to the survivors and the children of the survivors in this audience. Your suffering was so great, we will never properly understand it, nor the way the world abandoned you and your families so shamefully. Your courage over the years to convey your experiences to others has inspired all of us to work for the good. I speak to you, therefore, most humbly in a building devoted to your pain, to the immense pain felt by the victims of the largest organized destruction of humanity that was the Holocaust, most especially European Jewry, but also the Roma, homosexuals, the disabled, Polish nationalists, the communists, and captured Soviet POWs, a building located within yards of the seat of the world's biggest economic and military power. And I visit today as the UN Human Rights Chief, representing an office whose roots go back to Eleanor Roosevelt, a major force behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, itself the elegant and powerful response to the horrors expressed in this building. My office is located in Geneva in a building that once housed the League of Nations. In 1920, this was the world's riposte to the catastrophic violence of the First World War. A failed riposte, of course, a failed dream whose failure led us to the Holocaust and beyond. This morning is therefore filled with symbolism for me, not least because I am also the first Arab and Muslim UN Human Rights Chief, and therefore the first such official to visit the museum. Although I have been here before in my personal capacity, I have walked through the red brick walls and sat mesmerized by the stories, very human, touching, deeply sad stories told by those who suffered so greatly. I have spent years trying to understand all of this. I have traveled to Auschwitz-Birkenau at the invitation of the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide, with whom I've had a close association, and spent 2 days feeling sick at what I saw there. Everywhere, or everyone, must go there, of course. Everyone must learn. I've also traveled to Nuremberg and tried to grasp why so many ordinary people could kill so easily, feeling no guilt whatsoever, later in the courtrooms when faced with the irrefutable fact that their conduct amounted to a colossal crime. Why was there so little, perhaps no remorse? Almost all the Nazis convicted of their abominable crimes, even in their dying moments, felt that what they had done was excusable. Everything, as Leo Tolstoy once said, can be so easily rationalized, even if it is wrong, so dreadfully wrong, and piloted always by two variations of the same thought pattern. The first begins with this logic: I am not a bad person, but in the unyielding grip of a circumstance over which I have no control, what would you have me do? Risk my reputation, my career, possibly my life? Even if I know it is wrong, there is nothing but to do it, for it is the best of terrible choices. Of the many books written about the Holocaust, one of the most fascinating is Gita Sarani's Into That Darkness, an Examination of Conscience. In it, she describes the life of Franz Stangl, the most senior Nazi tracked down by Simon Wiesenthal, and the only commandant of a pure death camp, of two death camps, Sobibor and Treblinka, ever brought to trial. Specifically, she recalls in her book the interviews she conducted with Stangl after he was convicted and sentenced by a West German court in 1970. Of all the Nazi killers convicted, Stangl came closest to a genuine confession. In Sereni's last interview with him in June 1971, Stangl, after a long pause, muttered, and I quote, "So yes, I share the guilt," end quote. But then, instead of pursuing the thought to its logical conclusion and ending it with, "for the murder of hundreds of thousands of innocent people," he said instead, and I quote, "My guilt is that I am still here," end quote. Sereny believed that this was tantamount to a confession. To me, it sounds more like he copped out by not saying "for the murdering" or "for murdering so many innocent people." Instead, he had retreated into believing it had been a time of war, and with so many people having died in that war, he, as a military man, as a commandant, too should have died. To me, he had simply slipped back into the cradle of his lifelong belief that he had no choice. He had been forced to do what he did, and he would have been punished severely had he refused. The Ulm trial of 1958 exposed that general myth, however. There was not one documented case, not one, of a Nazi officer nor orderly being executed for refusing an order to murder. Not one. And there were cases of a refusal to murder, as the Auschwitz-Frankfurt trial made clear. The squad leader, Herbert Skerper, on one occasion could not continue to murder by phenol injection the young boys from Zamość, and he stopped. He refused to continue. He received no punishment, and this was well known at the time. So rather than being the exception, it seemed to be the norm. There was a choice. There was a choice. So why did so many, like Stangl, kill, later claiming they had no choice and feared punishment? Perhaps, given the SS's reputation for brutality, they simply dared not probe the choices, and fear could have tranquilized the conscience too. But in many cases, I suspect this argument was put forward only as a retrofit, when many of the accused viewed it as a clever, exonerating argument. Most people have experienced in everyday life circumstances, mainly when they were children, and the fear of being punished or sidelined for not conforming. So perhaps some ordinary people did kill because at times the fear of pain or punishment overwhelmed reality. But mostly, I suspect, because in the unique circumstances of that moment, they believed it was right. And this is the second, more disturbing variation of how we rationalize. They believed the killing, even of children, was entirely justified, even if they also knew it was, in some sense, awful. And once rationalized, the killing became mechanical, and the victims, the people, became non-people in the eyes of the killers and the torturers. In this context, it is worth recalling the extraordinary, troubling conversation between Hermann Goering and Gustav Gilbert, a psychologist during the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, as conveyed to us by Gilbert, and I quote, "Why? Of course the people don't want war," Goering shrugged. "Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. There is one difference, I, Gilbert speaking, pointed out. In a democracy, the people have some say in the matter, through their elected representatives. And in the United States, only Congress can declare wars. "Oh, that is well and good," replied Goering. "But, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of their leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in every country." End quote. Goering was a diabolical man, but he was, of course, telling a truth. People can be made to believe through clever messaging, well, virtually anything, especially in countries where obedience is prime and where they fear being called traitors. It all begins with a terrific lie, made not to the people, that comes later, but to yourself as a leader or future leader. It centers on the erroneous belief that circumstances dictate a special response, irrespective of history, its warnings and screams, and irrespective of the accumulated wisdom of humankind as enshrined in law. In some way, the special circumstances of the moment justify unorthodox responses. And the law, well, it may have to be breached temporarily because the challenge demands it. This logic is abundant around the world today. I torture because a war justifies it. I spy on my citizens because terrorism, repulsive as it is, requires it. I don't want new immigrants, or I discriminate against minorities because our communal identity or my way of life is being threatened as never before. I kill others because others will kill me, and so it goes, on and on. The lie also pivots on this belief. I, as an individual, know better. I see more clearly. I or my kind have been threatened, and the world, no matter what others will say, remains a continuing scramble for power and survival, and I, along with those I belong to, must run with it to avoid being run over by it. I define myself narrowly as belonging to a nationality or a religion or an ideology or race or an ethnicity. I attach myself stubbornly to one or maybe two of these points of reference, sometimes fed by a closed, narrow historical narrative, but not to a broader humanity and its laws, because they are only a mirage. Ridiculous, really. Survival explains my bigotry, my chauvinism, and my inherent feeling of superiority, although I would never admit those feelings in public, but in the end I know the truth. If you believe this, you lie. You are lying. You are lying to yourself. Whether you are a child absorbing the bigotry oozing from within a home, from within a school or a larger community, or a local political leader forming a political platform, or a national leader already swept into office. If you believe this, you are lying, because the truth is no less clear. If we have learned anything from our collective history, it is this: scrambling only for ourselves, our people, our political or religious ideology, or for our own kind, will only scramble it all, eventually, sometimes horrifyingly so, for everyone. If we are to fight, if we are to labor, we must then do so for every human being, and do so together. For humanity does exist, kindness exists, love carrying no passport, and unknowing of borders does exist. By dint of experience, centuries of human cruelty, 2 world wars, the Holocaust, genocides, and crimes against humanity aplenty, the laws have been written and fine-tuned. In the years after the Holocaust, specific treaties were negotiated to cement into law obligations to protect human rights. Countries the world over have accepted them. And now, alas, all too frequently, ignore them in practice. What we need, ladies and gentlemen, so badly is profound and inspiring leadership across the globe. A leadership that will care less about reputations based on matters of protocol. Who's invited to what summit? Who's a member of which G group of countries? Whether a leader speaks first or second at a conference, usually fussed over by a parade of media advisors. Instead, we need leadership that is concerned more about reputation based on whether the inalienable human rights and fundamental freedoms of their people and all others are defended and promoted. And this includes all rights, political, civil, economic, social, and cultural. We need leaders who will observe fully those laws and treaties drafted to end all discrimination, the privation of millions, and atrocity and excess in war, with no excuses entertained. Only then can we help ourselves out of the present serious, seemingly inexhaustible supply of crises that threaten to engulf us. I wake up every morning and, along with a brilliant staff, some of the world's best human rights lawyers and activists, I scan the news and am revolted by what I read. And I'm sure you feel all the same. Every day we are outraged by one piece of news or after another. In fact, we must fast be reaching a state of permanent disgust. The beheadings by the Takfiris in Syria, Iraq, Libya, of defenseless people horrify us, as does the savage burning of my compatriot, the pilot Mu'ath al-Kasasbe, rahimahullah. So too, the probable acts of genocide perpetrated by the Takfiris against the Yazidis in Iraq, enslavement, raping, and killing, including of children. These horrors are not limited just to the Middle East. Takfiri atrocities are also committed in Somalia, Nigeria, and Pakistan, and beyond. And the Takfiris are not alone. The Shia militia in Iraq and the Shabiha in Syria, all, including some government forces, have committed gruesome deeds. Some will say, therefore, what good are your treaties, your laws, and human rights, when non-state actors like the Takfiris, who call themselves Al-Qaeda, ISIL, Jabhat al-Nusra, Boko Haram, and the Shabab, etc., reject all of it and are bent on the nihilistic destruction of all who think differently to them, beginning with Muslims? Well, just bombing them or choking off their financing has clearly not worked, as that has now long been tried, for these groups have only proliferated and grown in strength. What is needed is the addition of a different sort of battle line, one waged principally by Muslim leaders and Muslim countries and based on ideas, on a reassertion of traditional Islam and the everyday narrative of Muslims. And this has started. In September of last year, 126 Muslim scholars directly, point by point, discredited the cruel, harsh ideology promoted by the leader of the Takfiris in Iraq, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. This is a hopeful beginning which deserves support. Regrettably, we also find the space for dissent in many countries is collapsing under the weight of either poorly thought out or indeed exploitative counter-terrorism strategies. Human rights defenders are therefore under enormous pressure in many parts of the world. These defenders deserve our deepest admiration and gratitude. They risk imprisonment or worse in the peaceful defense of basic rights, the right to freedom of expression and assembly, the right to due process and fair trial, and the rights of others not to experience arbitrary arrests and torture and the like. After all, years of tyranny, inequalities, fear, and bad governance are what contribute to the expansion of extremist ideas and ideas and violence. Few of these crises have erupted without warning. They have built up over years and sometimes decades of human rights grievances, deficient or corrupt governance, and judicial institutions, discriminations and exclusion, drastic inequalities, exploitation and the denial of economic and social rights, and repression of civil society and public freedoms. Specific kinds of human rights violations, including sexual violence, speech that incites violence, and patterns of discrimination against minorities, can provide early warning of the escalation of crisis into atrocity. With so much movement across our screens and newspapers, we believe we are now somehow cartwheeling into a future more uncertain and unpredictable than ever before. We are also bombarded by so many individual pieces of news and commentary. Our thoughts become equally scattered and devoid of any clear understanding of what it all means. Even today's editorials focus on slices of news, and no modern-day philosopher has synthesized all we see into a coherent whole, with remedies equal to the challenges. And so it would be easy for us to give way to a sense of complete hopelessness. But we cannot succumb to that way of thinking. Surely we know now from bitter experience that human rights are the only meaningful rampart against barbarity. Essentially, if I may boil down a massive topic into one sentence, states must be willing to protect the human rights of their people, and people must be able to hold the state responsible. This is the core mission of my office and the UN. A great body of international law which lays out our vital principles, such as the prohibition of torture and the equal and inalienable rights of women, is also essential. And human rights work carried out throughout the world is the heavy, slow, perhaps unsexy slog of training and advising so that governments around the world do adhere to their commitments to the law. That work may not be visible, and you will never see a star reporter declaim into her mic that she is coming to you live from a country where a crisis has not broken. But still it happens. Respect for human rights, for sound governance and due process, and the fair sharing of opportunities and resources can arrest further crises from developing further. Yet, despite our work and notwithstanding their commitments, governments and individuals still violate, as I already have noted, these conventions and fundamental moral principles. Since we cannot afford sinking into a state of paralyzing shock, our task becomes the need to strengthen our ethics, our clarity and openness of thought, and our moral courage. To do this, I can only suggest we must turn to a new and deeper form of education that goes beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic, to include skills and values that can equip people to act with responsibility and care. What good was it to humanity that Joseph Mengele had advanced degrees in medicine and anthropology, given that he was capable of committing the most inhumane crimes, or inhuman crimes? 8 of the 15 people who planned the Holocaust at Wannsee in 1942 held PhDs. They shone academically, and yet they failed to show the smallest shred of ethics and understanding. I'm increasingly supportive of the proposition that education of any kind, if it is devoid of a strong, universal human rights component, can be next to worthless when it should matter most, in crises when our world begins to unravel. Of course, we need schools to nurture curiosity and intelligence, knowledge of complex geometry or molecular cell biology or Cartesian philosophy, or thousands of other facets of the great kaleidoscope of human brilliance can be a precious thing. But when humanity topples on the cusp of real and vicious self-destruction, we don't necessarily need people who are only smart. We need people who are kind, people with PhD-level compassion, people who feel joy and generosity and love, and who have fully integrated the values that are essential to life in freedom and in dignity. We need people with a strong moral compass, and we need to help to build or rebuild that compass with education that includes a deeper moral content. As Viktor Frankl pointed out, and I quote, "Striving to find meaning in one's life is the primary motivational force in human beings," end quote. One of the lessons that Frankl gleaned from his experience of the Holocaust was that when they try to live without a larger sense of value, people give in to hatred, the lust for personal power, or indeed neurosis. Primo Levi was also convinced of the need for an education in responsibility and ethics. He told the Paris Review, and I quote, "I don't think scientific training, as one is taught in Italy or America, brings you to an especially ethical consciousness. It should. In my opinion, a young man or woman entering the university in natural science departments should be told sufficiently and heavily to remember that you are entering a profession where morality is important. You should be conscious of your impact in real life," end quote. Before every child on this planet turns 9, I believe he or she should acquire a foundational understanding of human rights, and that these concepts should grow in depth and scope as he or she develops. The underlying values of the curriculum would be virtually identical in every school, deriving from the universal and universally accepted Declaration of Human Rights. In this way, from Catholic parochial schools to the most secular public institutions, and indeed Islamic madaris, or madrasas in English, children could learn, even in kindergarten, the experience the fundamental human rights values of equality, justice, and respect. My children and yours and children everywhere need to learn what bigotry and chauvinism are, and the terrible wrongs they can produce. They need to learn that blind obedience can be exploited by authority figures for wicked ends. They should also learn they are not exceptional because of where they were born, how they look, what passport they carry, or the social class, caste, or creed of their parents. And they should learn that no one is intrinsically superior to her or his fellow human beings. Every child should be able to grasp that the wonderful diversity of individuals and cultures is a source of tremendous enrichment. They should learn to recognize their own biases and correct them. Children can learn to redirect their own aggressive impulses and use nonviolent means to resolve disputes. They can learn to be inspired by the courage of the pacifiers and those who assist, not those who destroy. They can be guided by human rights education to make informed choices in life, to approach situations with critical and independent thought, and to emphasize with other points, or to empathize with other points of view. Children are fully able to grasp the implications of human rights, and they are able too to understand the power that human rights principles bestow on them. Every child can help to shape her or his universe. This is the lesson of that physically tiny and yet symbolically immensely powerful young woman, Malala, who has enriched the moral heritage of humanity. We do not have to accept the world as it is. Indeed, we must not. We do not have to give in to the dark allure of hatred and violence. Indeed, it is vital that we find the energy to resist it. These lessons are surely as fundamental to life on Earth as advanced calculus. As we progress into this century, all of us will face moments of doubt and even despair. We may well encounter terrible suffering, but the clarity of human rights values and our faith in them will reseal our belief in ourselves. And in answer to Hermann Göring's assertion that people everywhere can be dragged into committing abuses by their leaders, we will offer this observation, or we will offer his observation, our most robust rejection. We will not be dragged anywhere by anyone at any time anymore. I thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Felt like a call to arms, call to action from you this morning. We're going to be taking questions from the audience. We're going to have some microphone runners on either side of the theater. So put your hand up with a question. Start formulating them now. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to ask a first one. You talked about the sort of legal architecture that was put in place after the Holocaust and that governs your work and the work in the human rights field. You've been in the job for 6 months now in the current position at the UN. Is that architecture and that institution up to the challenge that we face today around these issues of combating hate, combating atrocities, promoting human rights? Is it sufficient?
Thank you very much for the question, and it's a good question to get us started. What worries, I think, many of us is this tendency on the part of many governments to believe that appearance is enough, that the gleam of, or let's say the shine of adherence to a particular treaty is sufficient to sort of mesmerize populations around the world. It's not enough. It can only be considered enough if there's full resolve to implement the obligations under those particular treaties. And we do see a pattern developing where in many cases, on a declaratory level, the governments will reaffirm their commitment to the treaty, but on the ground, we do not see it happening. And no government or individual who discriminates or abuses a population does so without believing somehow that they're justified in doing it. They know what the law says, but they will say these circumstances are exceptional. We have to sort of do it differently for now. The people who drew up the particular convention didn't really appreciate how the world would change. And I think they failed to realize that treaties and laws are the accumulated wisdom of humankind. We've had enough war over the many millennia. We have decided that there had to be restrictions. The belief that somehow every circumstance is different and new, I think is wrong. It belittles our understanding of history. In most cases, our forebears have been through similar experiences. But they have learned that in the end, if you're going to outlaw torture, for instance, there are no exceptions to torture. The Torture Convention in the second article is absolutely clear. Torture is prohibited. No exceptions. Not in war, not in fighting asymmetric warfare is it permissible. And yet, sadly, we see in many parts of the world that this phenomenon still exists. And it's not to say that the leaders are bad people, but I think they import a logic which defies, again, the understanding, or our understanding of history and where it may lead to if you allow it to follow that course of thinking.
Great, thank you. So why don't we open it up to the floor? I'm going to take a couple of questions at a time so we can hopefully get a good mix. So right here in the middle, up front right here, and then over here. Why don't we do one over here?
Thank you. Good morning. So in your talk, you were mentioning hurtful or harmful speech. So my question is with respect to what we've seen with Charlie Hebdo and also throughout the world with, this generation of expressing your opinions. Where do we draw the line between what is freedom of speech and what is hate speech? And how do we strike a balance?
Thank you very much. Right here, up front.
Thank you. I'm Kumar from Amnesty International. The topic here is, can atrocities be prevented? For High Commissioner, if in some cases when it's not being prevented, then you have a mechanism, international justice system, ICC is one. If that also fails, because there are indications that even that is getting weakened and certain countries are avoiding getting punished there, will it encourage more atrocities by other leaders? So in a nutshell, when international justice system fails, is it giving a message to the world leaders that they can go ahead and commit mass crimes and escape? Thank you.
Thank you. And there was one, right here in the front, yes.
Are you concerned with the growing Islamophobia in the Western world? And do you think that this fear of the other and fear of difference could be similarly exploited and lead to a similar crisis?
So great sampling of questions on hate speech. What do we do when international justice fails and fear of the other?
The questions are so good, I feel I'm sitting in an advanced exam in grad school. What a way to start a morning. You must have all had strong coffee. All right, the first question. These are the two articles of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 19 and 20, or 19 and 20 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, freedom of expression, and the issue of incitement to hatred. And it is a very difficult issue, in particular to discuss because it can become so emotive or emotional for all the participants in the discussion, as I'm sure you've experienced yourselves. My understanding, and I'm hoping that I speak for my office. My office, I have 1,200, highly educated human rights lawyers, all of whom are rebellious, and so they don't always listen to me. So I hope I'm representing their view. But my view on this is that the freedom of expression is the surest antidote to tyranny. To tyranny. It has to be defended, and we will defend it, and we will stand foursquare in front of it. But one must understand as well that while the boundaries have to be far and wide, in exercise of that right, we have to believe that we are reasonable human beings, educated human beings, who know our history, who know the evolution of human development, so that if people want to speak at the absolute margins of what is permissible, those people are rare. If there's a density of that sort of opinion at the margin, then crossing over into the other part of it, the incitement to hatred, becomes very real. So the right has to be protected, it has to be safeguarded. But in exercise of the right, you hope with high levels of education and awareness of one's history, human history, that there is self-restraint, that we respect each other, that we are bound together. And we will, if people want to exercise the right at the extreme, they can. And the danger is that they drag half of the population with them, and then we have a very dangerous situation developing. And so we have to keep it in balance. On the question of impunity, if we don't see those accused of the vilest crimes being punished? Does this encourage others? I think in the short term, probably, yes. But, in the end, we hope that with the sufficient body of evidence collected in time, all those main authors of the worst crimes will be pursued and punished. We're going through this transition. The Rome Statute was only signed in 1998, and it sought to overturn, again, 2 millennia of practice, and so the world needs time to adjust to it. But I'm hopeful that in another 20, 30, 40 years' time, we will have turned the corner on atrocities. Is Islamophobia a concern? I think we see so much now discrimination along so many different axes. It is a concern to us, whether it be discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, who you are and who you love, and all of this we must fight against. We must fight against. It's unacceptable. How many horror stories must we see to understand this point? And so it does concern me, and I hope it concerns all of you as well.
Thank you. Why don't we take a few more questions? Why don't we go into the back this time a little bit? We have one on the side here, and this gentleman in the back as well, in the second to the last row, and then right here in the middle. Thanks.
Good morning. We have questions coming in from our Twitter following, and I just wanted to share one of them with you.
Uh-oh.
More good ones. Under your predecessor, the United Nations elevated LGBT rights, insisting that LGBT rights are human rights. Yet we see countries continue the criminalization of LGBT people, and we continue to see atrocities against them. What plans do you have as High Commissioner to continue upon the work of your predecessor?
That was the longest Twitter message I've ever heard. Okay, three Twitters. Okay, good. Back here.
Hello, I'm Eli Pressberg. I attend the School for Ethics and Global Leadership here in Washington, which I think focuses on that ethical education, which you said was so important. So that was nice. But what I wanted to ask you about is that in previous atrocities, such as the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide, we saw sort of an unwillingness to act from the international community, especially since it was in the wake of previous conflicts, such as the Cold War and World War I. And I was wondering what you thought we could do to combat that timidity and that passivity.
Great. And right here. Just hold on 1 second, Kelly.
Thank you. I'm with the Human Rights Law Section, Department of Homeland Security. We're a small group devoted to the investigation, prosecution, and deportation of war criminals and human rights violators here in the U.S. My question for you is in regards to the potential dilution of fundamental human rights as represented in the Universal Declaration and the two covenants in particular by the ongoing hyperproliferation of rights treaties, new instruments, and whether you believe that there is a way to perhaps combat that dilution of fundamental rights, and also to, in fact, enforce those fundamental rights rather than states, as you said, paying homage to them merely by signing more treaties.
So another round of easy softball questions for you. LGBT rights, timidity in the international system and our unwillingness to act, and a proliferation of rights instruments.
Yeah. No, all good questions. I sense the longer I speak, the more hands go up, so I don't know what I say. The issue of LGBT rights and the criminalization of and the persecution of those people who are no different from us, who love different people, maybe to us, is really appalling. And we will speak out. I have spoken out. We will speak out. every time we see a community hounded and attacked. It is wholly unacceptable, wholly unacceptable. What is it that we can do? Well, we can all speak out together. We ran a campaign, highly successful, Free and Equal. I ask all of you who are interested and who have your own campaigns to pair with us, and we can work together on this. It is tough. There are a lot of people out there who will find one excuse or another, but it is unacceptable that people should be persecuted in any way on the basis of who they are, who they love. The question regarding timidity, it is really, really tough, this. General Dallaire, in the early days of the Rwanda genocide, at one stage remarked that he felt like taking a wheelbarrow filled with bodies to the UN Security Council and offloading those bodies to get countries to move. It is a difficult issue, this, because you think, as reasonable human beings, why are we not doing anything about this? One of my deepest concerns is a sort of deadening effect that's beginning to take root. That if the margin of human behavior, the very extreme of human behavior that we've seen, perpetrated by principally Daesh, the crucifixions, the beheadings, the burnings, if that is the limit which would prompt us then to act, then what about everything else short of that? How do we motivate ourselves to act where we see patterns of discrimination that are highly alarming? Do we just say, well, one killing here, one killing there, it happens, sort of thing? And how do we motivate publics? I don't have the answer for that. I don't. But I think we need to force a discussion on it. It sort of reminds me of, being in medical school. I wasn't in medical school, but I had enough friends who were. And the first, I was at Johns Hopkins. You have to expect that. The first week, you're working on a cadaver, and the first day you're probably feeling nauseous and you don't feel well. The second day you feel it's pretty much routine, and by the end of the week you're okay. In the same way, when I was serving in my previous job on the Security Council, and we would see images and be exposed to the most dreadful reports, day in, day out, from the Central African Republic, from South Sudan, from Syria, in the end, just the volume and the severity of it makes you so numb that you don't know how to respond anymore. And this is the danger we have in one way with so much of this being exposed, online and in the media. It is necessary. People need to know this is happening. But there is this other effect which I think we need to keep in mind and not be driven into sort of apathy about it and the timidity that some governments may feel. Finally, on this point, because I feel very strongly about this, we don't believe in the collective effort that we once believed in. A UN report came out last year which showed that UN peacekeepers, there were something over 400 cases, separate cases, where UN peacekeepers were not defending populations under imminent threat. Why? The reason why is that most governments sort of feel that they don't want to incur casualties because they have to then explain to their people that their people are dying, their soldiers are dying in countries where there's no national interest, that it is a UN interest or a UN commitment. And that collective sort of desire to shape the world together is ebbing. And to address the first point, if you took one of the conventions put together at the end of the Second World War, let's take the Refugee Convention, the 1951 Convention, and we tried to negotiate exactly the same terms today, we wouldn't be able to do it. No? So we have to try harder, and we have to try better. The last question on the proliferation. If you look at the proliferation of the last number of treaties that we have signed, the convention for instance, that relates to disability. You know, it's something that I think all of us believe it was required. Initially, there was a feeling that the standard rules were sufficient, and then we realized that no, this is not a luxury. 12% of every population is disabled. All of us, if we mature into ripe old age, we will be disabled, and we will need help. You know, these are not luxuries. These are rights. These are rights, and they have to be seen in the form of obligations. And so it's not a question of whether it's a burden or not, and we have to report, and we have to send the High Commissioner who's beating us around the head some sort of explanation. No, these are rights. These are rights to your people, and you must honor them. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time for our discussion, but I'm so grateful for all of your time this morning and for giving us a lot to think about and a motivating speech, and I hope it's been well received in Washington. Thank you all for coming this morning.